The warm afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the countryside venue, bathing everything in a golden glow. Rows of white chairs lined the lush green lawn, each tied with ribbons that fluttered gently in the breeze. Strings of fairy lights hung above, their bulbs twinkling even in the daylight, hinting at the magic that would unfold later. The air carried the scent of roses and lilies, mingling with a faint aroma of freshly baked bread from the catering tent. Emma stood just beyond the archway, hidden from most of the guests, her fingers trembling slightly as they clutched her bouquet. The delicate lace of her gown brushed the floor, and the tightness in her chest wasn't from the corset but from the weight of the day. Her smile appeared when someone looked her way, but as soon as their gaze shifted, the corners of her lips fell. Her eyes kept darting to the large oak doors at the edge of the lawn, almost as if she was waiting for someone who hadn't arrived. Across the lawn, Daniel greeted guests with easy charm. His tailored navy suit fit him perfectly, and his confident laugh blended effortlessly with the hum of chatter. He shook hands, clapped friends on the back, and posed for quick photos, all the while keeping his polished, practiced smile in place. Yet, there was a flicker in his eyes, something guarded, almost calculating, that no one seemed to notice except Emma. Linda, tall and striking in her emerald green dress, floated from table to table like a hostess on a mission. She complimented outfits, ensured wine glasses stayed full, and slipped in small mentions of the family's long-standing ties to the community. Every detail mattered to her today. She fussed over the flower arrangements, adjusted the bridesmaid's hair, and whispered instructions to the photographer. Yet, even she glanced toward the oak doors once or twice, her lips tightening. The guests settled into their seats, some leaning toward each other with curious whispers. "Is George really not coming?" one woman asked under her breath. "After everything, I can't imagine," another replied. A few shook their heads knowingly, exchanging stories of the old man's stubbornness, his decorated service in the army, and the falling out that had kept him away for years. A violin began to play softly, and the air shifted with anticipation. Emma took a deep breath, her grip on the bouquet tightening. The laughter and conversation around her faded to a dull hum. The oak doors remained closed, and she told herself it didn't matter. But in the quiet space behind her forced smile, she could feel an absence, a presence missing that, even after years of silence, still mattered more than she wanted to admit. 3 years earlier, the air in the family dining room had been heavy with the smell of roasted chicken and tension. Grandpa George sat at the head of the table, his posture straight as ever, his weathered hands folded neatly in front of him. Emma remembered the way his eyes, sharp, the same gray-blue as hers, hadn't once left Daniel throughout the meal. Daniel, for his part, seemed completely at ease, chatting about a new business opportunity that, he claimed, would change everything for them. It had been during dessert that George finally spoke. "Emma," he began, his voice calm but edged with steel, "this man you're planning to marry, do you know who has been meeting with?" The clink of cutlery stopped. Linda glanced up sharply, her brows knitting. Daniel set down his fork slowly, as though he already knew where this was going. George reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded stack of papers. "I've been keeping my ears open. Daniel's been making deals with developers, big ones. And the only reason they're interested is because they think he can get his hands on our land. Land that's still in my name." Emma had stared at him in confusion. "Grandpa, that doesn't make sense. Daniel's been helping with the business." "Helping himself," George interrupted. His voice didn't rise, but there was a finality to his tone that made the air feel colder. "He's already put down a deposit on property that doesn't belong to him. He's taken out loans in his company's name that he can't repay. His gambling, Emma, with your future." Linda slammed her napkin down on the table. "Oh, for heaven's sake, George. This is ridiculous. You've never liked Daniel. You're just jealous because he's young and successful, and you can't control Emma anymore." That had been the spark that lit the fire. The conversation turned into a storm. Linda accusing George of being bitter and paranoid, George accusing Linda of caring more about appearances than her daughter's safety. Emma had tried to speak, but her words got lost in the chaos. Daniel sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable, only breaking his silence to say, "I don't have to sit here and be insulted." The night ended with George pushing his chair back, his cane tapping against the floor as he stood. "If you don't want to hear the truth, then I have nothing else to say. But remember this, Emma, when the day comes, I'll be there to stop it." After that, George moved out of the family home and cut off nearly all contact. He didn't return calls, and letters were rare, just short, handwritten notes to Emma, often with no return address. She kept them in a box under her bed, rereading them on nights when she missed him too much to sleep. In those notes, he never mentioned Daniel, only asked about her well-being, the weather, and small memories they shared. Linda, meanwhile, doubled down on her disapproval. "Is old-fashioned and stubborn," she'd tell Emma. "You can't let him dictate your life." The message was clear. If Emma wanted to keep peace in the family, she would have to choose. And for a long time, she chose silence. Daniel's charm and carefully timed gestures kept doubts at bay, but they never vanished completely. There were whispers of unpaid invoices, business trips that didn't match his receipts, and conversations that stopped when Emma walked into the room. She told herself she was overthinking, until she overheard him on the phone one evening, his voice low but sharp. "They won't sell to you now," he said to the unseen person on the other end. "But once I marry her, the land will be ours. I can make them sign." Emma froze in the hallway, her hand hovering over the light switch. A sick, twisting feeling settled in her stomach. She wanted to confront him right there, but he ended the call before she could step forward. And when she asked about it later, he laughed it off as business jargon she wouldn't understand. Still, she stayed. Maybe because she wanted to believe her mother was right about him. Maybe because walking away would mean admitting her grandfather had been right all along. But somewhere deep down, a quiet fear had taken root, waiting for the day it would grow too big to ignore. That day was now here. The bridal dressing room smelled faintly of hairspray and fresh peonies. Mirrors lined one wall, surrounded by glowing bulbs, their soft light making Emma's skin appear flawless. Two makeup artists hovered over her, one dabbing powder along her cheekbones, the other perfecting the curve of her lipstick. Her bridesmaids chatted nearby, sipping champagne and taking selfies in their blush-colored dresses. Emma smiled when they looked her way, but her reflection betrayed her. Beneath the carefully done curls and the smooth white silk of her gown, there was a tightness in her eyes she couldn't mask. She tried to focus on the laughter in the room, the clicking of heels against the tiled floor, the sound of the photographer snapping away. But her mind kept wandering. Her phone, resting on the vanity, buzzed once. The vibration was short, sharp, almost out of place in the cozy hum of the room. She reached for it without thinking. The message was from an unknown number. "Don't marry him. Meet me by the back gate." Gee, Emma's heart gave a small, startled kick. She read it twice, her fingers hovering over the screen. She didn't have to guess who G was. Grandpa George hadn't called her in years, but his signature initial was unmistakable. For a moment, she considered showing it to someone, maybe her maid of honor, but she imagined the look on her mother's face if she found out. Linda would call it sabotage. She'd say George was being dramatic again, trying to ruin her perfect day. Emma slipped the phone back down, telling herself she would ignore it. Her hand trembled slightly as the makeup artist fixed her eyeliner. She focused on breathing evenly, but each inhale seemed harder than the last. Somewhere beyond the closed door, Daniel's voice drifted through, low and confident. She caught only a few words at first, then the faint rustle of footsteps, and then another voice, deeper, colder. "You'll have it all by next week," Daniel was saying. The other man chuckled. "Once the land's signed over, she can think whatever she wants." Emma froze. The words felt like ice water down her spine. She glanced toward the door, wondering if she had really heard them or if her mind was twisting things again. But when Daniel laughed softly in response, the sound carried a sharpness she didn't recognize. In the hallway, unseen by the bride, a young flower girl in a puffy white dress stood clutching her basket of petals. She had been looking for her mother but stopped when she heard the strange conversation. Her small brow furrowed. She didn't understand most of what they were talking about, but she recognized Emma's name and the mention of land. When Daniel and the man in the dark suit walked away, the girl tiptoed to the back exit of the venue, the one that led to the gravel path near the gardens. Outside, under the shade of an old oak tree, she spotted an older man leaning on a cane, his gaze fixed on the building. She didn't know him, but something about the way he stood, steady, watchful, made her trust him. "Are you here for the wedding?" she asked in a small voice. George looked down at her, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "Something like that." The flower girl stepped closer, glancing around as if sharing a secret. "I heard the man in the blue suit say something about land, and you should know." George's eyes narrowed slightly, though his expression remained calm. "Thank you," he said, crouching slightly so they were eye level. "You did the right thing." Inside, Emma sat motionless as the finishing touches were applied to her makeup. Her friends were laughing about some old college story, but the words blurred together. The text message replayed in her mind, over and over, until it was the only thing she could hear. "Don't marry him." The first soft notes of the violin floated through the air, filling the church with a hush that felt almost sacred. Emma stood at the entrance, her bouquet trembling slightly in her hands. The scent of lilies and polished wood surrounded her as she began the slow walk down the aisle. Every step felt heavier than the last, each smiling face she passed blurring into a haze of color. Daniel stood at the altar, his smile as bright and confident as ever. The sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows painted him in shades of red, blue, and gold, giving him an almost saintly glow. Emma's heart, however, was not steady. It was loud and uneven, like the pounding of distant drums. Halfway down the aisle, she caught her mother's eye. Linda sat in the front pew, posture perfect, her emerald dress gleaming under the light. She gave Emma a small, approving nod, as if to say, "Everything is as it should be." Emma forced a small smile back, but the echo of the earlier text still lingered in her chest. She reached the altar, the priest smiling warmly as the guests shifted forward in anticipation. The ceremony began, words about love, trust, and unity flowing like gentle waves. Daniel took her hands, and the priest's voice softened as he moved toward the vows. Then, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the church swung open with a sharp creak that cut through the moment like a blade. Heads turned. A few gasps broke the silence. Grandpa George stood framed in the doorway, dressed in his old dark suit, the same one he'd worn to Emma's high school graduation. His shoulders were straight, his chin lifted, his walking stick tapping against the floor in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The years had weathered him, but his presence filled the space with quiet authority. Linda's face drained of color. She half rose from her seat, her mouth forming a silent no. Daniel's smile faltered, though he quickly replaced it with a look of polite surprise. George walked forward, his gaze locked only on Emma. He didn't glance at the guests or at Linda, not even at Daniel. The tap of his cane echoed in the church, each step seeming to stretch time itself. When he reached the midpoint of the aisle, his voice carried clearly, strong despite his age. "Emma, you deserve the truth before you say yes." The priest blinked, glancing between them. "So, we're in the middle of." "Then let me finish what I started years ago," George said, his tone unshakable. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The violinist had stopped playing. Emma's hands loosened around her bouquet, petals brushing against the floor. Daniel shifted slightly, the faintest trace of unease in his posture. "George," he began with a strained chuckle, "this isn't the time." George ignored him. He took another step closer, the light from the high windows catching the silver in his hair. "3 years ago, I warned you," he said to Emma, "and you didn't want to believe me. I don't blame you. But today, before you speak those vows, you need to hear the truth. All of it." Emma's pulse roared in her ears. She could feel every eye on her, but it was only George she saw, standing tall and steady, like a man who had nothing left to lose and nothing left to hide. George stopped a few feet from the altar and reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. His movements were deliberate, not hurried, and yet the silence in the church grew heavier with every second. He withdrew a thick manila envelope, its edges worn, and held it up for everyone to see. "I didn't come here to cause a scene," he began, his voice steady but edged with the weight of 3 years' worth of restraint. "I came here because I couldn't let my granddaughter walk into a life built on lies." Linda stood now, her face taut. "George, that's enough." "Sit down, Linda," George said without raising his voice. The authority in his tone made her freeze mid-step. He turned back to Emma. "These are bank records, Emma. Proof that Daniel owes over $400,000 in unpaid debts, gambling debts, failed investments, and personal loans under fake company names." He opened the envelope and held up a printed statement with glaring red balances. The priest shifted uncomfortably. Guests craned their necks, whispering. Emma's eyes locked on the paper, the blackened red numbers blurring as her breath quickened. George continued, pulling out another stack of papers. "And these are contracts, negotiations with real estate developers. He's been trying to sell our family land, without your knowledge, because he knows it's still in my name. Once you were married, he planned to push for the deed transfer and take the payout." Daniel's jaw tightened. "This is absurd. Those are doctored." "Really?" George reached into the envelope again and pulled out a small digital recorder. "Because I also have this." He pressed the play button, and Daniel's voice filled the church. The sound was unmistakable, smooth, cocky, laced with arrogance. "Once I marry her, the land's as good as mine. She won't even see it coming." There was a sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the pews. Emma's grip on her bouquet loosened until it slipped from her fingers and fell soundlessly onto the red carpet. George looked at her, his expression softening for just a moment. "I wish I could tell you this is all, but it's not." The scene seemed to shift as George spoke, the present giving way to flashes of the past, images as sharp as if they'd happened yesterday. Daniel hunched over a desk late at night, forging George's signature on a set of legal documents, the tip of his pen scratching like a whisper in the dark. Daniel shaking hands with a man in a designer suit outside a high-rise office building, his smile wide and false. Daniel standing in the kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, telling Emma he was in Chicago for a client meeting, while the view outside his hotel window clearly showed a beachfront resort in Miami. Each fragment hit Emma like a blow. She remembered every moment differently before, every line neatly wrapped in charm, every story delivered with such confidence she'd never thought to question. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, some guests exchanging shocked glances, others staring at Daniel in open disbelief. George let the silence stretch for a moment after the recording ended. "Emma, I tried to tell you years ago, but your mother didn't want to listen. And maybe you weren't ready then, but you deserve to be ready now, before you make the biggest mistake of your life." Emma's vision swam. The air in the church felt thick, hard to breathe. She looked at Daniel, hoping, maybe foolishly, that there would be some denial that felt true, something in his eyes that could convince her. But Daniel's gaze had shifted. It wasn't the charming warmth she'd fallen for. It was cold, calculating, the look of a man caught and already weighing his next move. Her hands trembled at her sides. Every muscle in her body screamed to move, to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Only her heartbeat filled her ears, fast and loud, drowning out everything else. Daniel took a step forward, his polished shoes clicking against the stone floor, his voice steady but carrying an edge. "This is pathetic," he said, gesturing toward George with a dismissive flick of his hand. "He's bitter because we didn't let him control the family anymore. That's all this is, an old man with a bruised ego, trying to ruin what should be the happiest day of our lives." A ripple of discomfort moved through the guests, a few shifting in their seats. Daniel pressed on, his tone gaining false confidence. "Those documents. Anyone could print fake statements and make them look real. It's not hard in this day and age. His spinning lies because he can't stand the idea of me and Emma building a future without his interference." George didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a slim cell phone, holding it up between 2 fingers. "Call the bank, right now. On speaker. Let everyone hear it from them." Daniel's eyes darted toward the phone for a fraction of a second before he shook his head with an incredulous laugh. "I'm not going to play into this ridiculous charade. This is a wedding, not a courtroom." "That's what I thought," George replied, his tone calm but cutting. Linda stood abruptly, her voice sharp with urgency. Enough. This has gone far enough. Emma, sweetheart, this is nonsense. Let's just move on, finish the vows, and celebrate with our guests. We can sort out any misunderstandings later. Her gaze flicked toward the guests, and Emma recognized the tight smile, a mask meant to hide cracks in the family's perfect image. Emma didn't answer. She was staring at the man she had once thought she knew, trying to reconcile the smooth, confident groom with the cold voice she'd heard on that recording. Daniel's eyes were on her now, his expression softening into something that looked like concern, but felt, deep down, like calculation. And then, without warning, her mind pulled her somewhere else entirely. She saw herself as a little girl, wobbling on a too-big bicycle in the driveway of her grandparents' house. George was there, jogging beside her, one steady hand on the seat, the other ready to catch her if she fell. Don't look down, he'd said, smiling in the late summer sun. Trust yourself, and if something feels wrong, stop. Always stop. Another memory followed, of sitting on the porch steps years later, crying over a friend's betrayal. George had handed her a glass of lemonade, his voice low but certain. Your instincts are your best friend, Emma. People can lie to you. Words can fool you. But that feeling in your gut, it's there for a reason. Her eyes refocused on the present. The same feeling she'd had back then, the quiet twist in her stomach, was now a roaring certainty. Daniel was still speaking, still weaving words meant to sway her, but she barely heard him. The weight of the bouquet was gone from her hands. The air felt sharper in her lungs, and her heart, though pounding, felt steady in its choice. She glanced at George. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held hers, steady and sure, just as they had when he'd let go of that bicycle seat for the first time. Emma stood perfectly still for a long moment, her gaze fixed on Daniel as if she was seeing him for the first time. The room felt unbearably quiet, every breath and shift of fabric amplified in the hush. Then, slowly, she turned her head toward George. His expression was calm, but his eyes, steady and unwavering, held the weight of everything unsaid between them. Her hands moved without hesitation. She reached up, fingers sliding beneath the comb that held her veil in place. The delicate fabric slipped free and floated to the ground, pooling softly on the red carpet. The sound of it landing was barely a whisper, but in the silence of the church, it was deafening. Daniel's smile faltered completely. Emma. She took a step back, her voice trembling but clear. If you can lie to me before the vows, what will you do after? Gasps and low murmurs rippled through the guests. Somewhere near the back, a chair scraped against the floor as someone stood. The tension broke like a dam, and several guests began to rise, whispering to each other as they made for the exit. Daniel's jaw clenched. He looked around the room, as if willing someone to speak up for him, to restore the image he'd worked so hard to project. No one did. His hands curled into fists at his sides. This isn't over, he muttered, his voice low but filled with venom. He turned toward George, his eyes narrowing. You'll regret this. George didn't respond, only watched him with the same steady gaze he'd held all along. Daniel straightened his jacket, lifted his chin, and strode down the aisle, the sharp sound of his shoes echoing off the stone walls until the heavy church doors swung shut behind him. Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The room was half empty now, but she didn't care. She bent to pick up the veil from the floor, then paused and let it be. Her hands found George's instead. For the first time in years, she felt certain she'd made the right choice. Emma turned fully toward George, her vision blurring as tears finally broke free. The steady mask she'd worn all morning cracked, and she stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him. His embrace was warm, solid, unchanged from the way it had been when she was a little girl seeking comfort after scraped knees or hurt feelings. I'm so sorry, she whispered against his shoulder. I should have listened to you. I should have believed you. George gave a small chuckle, though his voice was thick when he replied. You believed me when it mattered. Kiddo, that's what counts. From the corner of her eye, Emma caught sight of her mother. Linda stood rigid for a moment, scanning the half-empty church as if trying to calculate what this would do to her social standing. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and without a word, she lifted her clutch and walked briskly toward the doors. The click of her heels faded until they were gone entirely. George leaned back just enough to look Emma in the eye. "There's something you should know," he said. "That land Daniel wanted so badly. It's already yours. I had the deed changed to your name a year ago. Figured if the day ever came when you needed it, I didn't want to waste time with paperwork." Emma's breath caught. You did that for me." He smiled faintly. "It's your family's legacy. I wanted it to stay with the only person I trust to honor it." They stood there for another moment, just the two of them, before George offered his arm. "Come on, let's get out of here. I think we've had enough of weddings for one day." They walked side by side down the aisle, past the scattered petals and abandoned programs, past the guests who lingered in small, stunned clusters. As they stepped out of the church, the heavy clouds that had gathered earlier began to part, allowing sunlight to spill across the steps in soft, golden beams. Emma tilted her face toward the warmth, feeling lighter than she had in years. Beside her, George adjusted his hat and glanced at her with a hint of a smile. Sometimes, she thought, her heart finally steady, the right person walks into your life, even if it's in the middle of your wedding.